They said that if even a single Swiss guard moved during the funeral of Pope Francis, it would dishonor not just the Church, but the memory of the Pope himself. That was the rule. That was the sacred code drilled into every guard standing beneath the cold gray skies of St. Peter's Square that morning. And yet, one man moved. In a sea of unwavering blue, gold, and red, one step broke centuries of silence. One heartbeat shattered 500 years of tradition. And in that frozen moment, every eye, from the humble faithful to the most powerful cardinals, turned toward him. Adrian Meyer, a name unknown to the world, a guard trained to be invisible, immovable, a living statue in the shadow of the Holy See. And yet today, he would become unforgettable. Before we reveal what Adrian did, and why it left the entire Vatican stunned, take a second to subscribe to the channel. If you love stories where duty and heart collide, where tradition is tested by courage, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that button and be part of the journey. Now, back to Adrian. The early light barely touched the ancient stones of the square. Mist curled around the marble columns like forgotten prayers. The air was thick with incense and expectation as the funeral procession moved slowly toward the gathered crowds. Adrian stood motionless, his polished black boots anchored to the cobblestones. His halberd, a weapon he knew better than his own reflection, glinted with the somber glow of dawn. His chest plate gleamed, his uniform flawless, his face carved from stone. But beneath that perfect surface, a secret pressed against his heart. Hidden under the layers of velvet and steel, Adrian carried something no one else knew about. A letter, written by a dying pope, addressed only to him. And when the moment came, when the world expected stillness, Adrian would move. Not because he forgot his oath, but because perhaps he finally understood it. Adrian Meyer had never broken formation in 14 years of service. Not once. Not in training. Not during ceremonies. Not even during the rare moments of pure chaos when tourists swarmed too close or protesters tried to disrupt a blessing. He was the kind of guard who could disappear into the background simply by standing still, the way tradition demanded. But that morning, as the organ's low morning notes trembled through the thick air of the square, Adrian could feel his own heartbeat pressing against the thin sheet of paper hidden under his armor. He thought back to the moment, 2 weeks before, when a tired old priest had knocked quietly on the barracks door and slipped the letter into his hand. No grand ceremony, no formal orders, just a whisper. From him. For you. At first, Adrian hadn't opened it. For days, he had carried it pressed against his ribs, feeling its weight like a second heartbeat. He had wanted to pretend it didn't exist. That loyalty to the guard meant silence, meant stillness. But the Pope had known better. Inside that envelope were not commands, not doctrine, just words from one human soul to another. When the time comes, the letter said, you will know. And now, standing among thousands, under the gaze of the world, Adrian knew. The world around him blurred. The chanting faded to a distant hum. There was only the coffin, plain, unadorned, moving closer, step by solemn step. He could see the faces of his brothers in arms, steeled, proud, unshakable. He could feel the heavy gaze of the cardinals, the archbishops, the politicians, all wrapped in their own armor of expectation. He could hear the silent roar of history itself, commanding him to remain a statue. But then, he remembered, the way Pope Francis had smiled, tired but warm, in that quiet room. The way he had placed a trembling hand on Adrian's shoulder and said, "The Church is made of men, not marble." If this story is already pulling you in, if you believe that sometimes true strength is found not in standing still, but in daring to move, hit the subscribe button now. We bring you real moments of courage you'll never forget. Join us. And now, let's continue. Adrian's breathing slowed. He counted the steps. 1, 2, 3. The coffin passed by, just feet away from where he stood. His grip on the halberd tightened, leather gloves creaking under the strain. This was it. Every part of his body screamed at him to hold his ground, to blend back into the sea of blue, red, and gold, to vanish like a good soldier should. But then he moved, not wildly, not dramatically, simply a step. The sharp echo of his boot hitting the stone cracked the air like a gunshot. Heads turned instantly. A ripple ran through the square. Priests, nuns, journalists, even the cardinals stiffened in their places. Adrian could feel their stares clawing at him, feel the centuries of judgment bearing down. But he didn't falter. With deliberate precision, he shifted his halberd to his left hand and reached into his breastplate. Slowly, reverently, as if performing an ancient rite. From inside, he drew the letter. The fragile piece of parchment, already worn soft from the heat of his own body. He crossed the last few feet to the coffin, each step deliberate, each heartbeat a drumbeat of rebellion. The cameras snapped. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Adrian knelt, a single knee touching the cold stone. He placed the letter gently atop the wooden coffin, right beneath the simple crucifix resting there. His gloved fingers lingered for just a moment. No words spoken. Only a silent farewell. And then, without looking left or right, he rose. Stepped backward exactly 3 paces. Resumed his post. Still as a statue once more. But the damage, or the miracle, had already been done. For a long moment, no one moved. The Vatican, a place that had stood through wars, reformations, and centuries of unshakable tradition, seemed to hold its breath. A single letter, resting gently atop a simple wooden coffin, had shaken the foundation of the most disciplined force in the world. Some of the cardinals frowned, whispering to each other behind tightly pressed lips. A few guards stiffened, unsure whether to react or stay still. An old nun in the crowd wiped away a tear, though whether from grief or admiration, no one could say. And Adrian stood exactly where he had always stood. Halberd in hand. Back straight. Face calm. To the outside world, nothing about him had changed. He was still the same silent sentinel, lost among the ranks of the Swiss Guard. But inside, everything had shifted. He had chosen not obedience to stone, but loyalty to spirit. Not tradition for tradition's sake, but tradition for the soul it was meant to honor. He had moved when the world demanded he stay still. And somehow, in doing so, he had honored every vow he had ever made, in a way standing still never could. The funeral continued. The choir rose in solemn hymn. The incense swung through the air, thick and heavy. The ancient rituals flowed on, as they had for centuries. But high above the swirling incense, above the whispered prayers, above the river of black coats and bowed heads, there was now a letter. A single act of defiance. A single act of faith. And long after the cameras stopped rolling, long after the diplomats boarded their planes, long after the stone walls of St. Peter's Square faded back into ordinary silence, that moment remained, etched in memory, etched in hearts, etched perhaps where it mattered most, in the place where tradition meets courage, where loyalty is measured not by silence, but by love. So now, I ask you, if you stood where Adrian Meyer stood, knowing the cost, would you have moved? Tell us in the comments below. We want to hear your voice. And if this story touched something inside you, if you believe that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take a single step, hit that subscribe button. Help us share more stories that remind us what courage really looks like. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.